Maponga breaks the silence with truths that shake the foundations of power. He is not alone. Alongside figures like Ndlozi and Captain Traoré, a movement to unite Africa and expose false leaders is gaining unprecedented strength. Prepare yourself for a shocking revelation. If you believe in the power of unity and in leaders who dare to challenge the status quo to build a better future, this is the place for you. Subscribe to the channel. A renewed fervor, like an ancient flame rekindled by the winds of change, was sweeping across the African continent, carrying with it the seeds of a long-dreamed of union and the promise of a purge of leaders who had betrayed the trust of their people. At the epicenter of this awakening, a charismatic and controversial figure, known for his ancient wisdom and incisive rhetoric, was emerging with a force few had anticipated. Maponga, the orator who seemed to carry in his voice the echo of generations of kings and warriors, was preparing to drop what many were already calling the truth bomb. His message, delivered through impassioned speeches in public squares, powerful interviews on community radio stations, and viral videos that crossed borders at lightning speed, was a call to conscience and action. Maponga did not mince words in denouncing what he called false leaders, those who, under the guise of nationalist rhetoric or supposed dedication to the people, served their own interests or foreign agendas, perpetuating the exploitation and misery that so afflicted the continent. What made the moment particularly explosive was the convergence of voices. Maponga was not alone in his outcry. Prominent figures such as Ndlozi, the South African intellectual and politician known for his eloquent critique of neocolonialism and social inequalities, and Captain IBRAHIM Traoré, the young leader of Burkina Faso who had recently defied France and exposed alleged secret plots, each seemed to echo, in their own way, the same sense of urgency and the same vision of a united and sovereign Africa. The idea of an informal but powerful alliance between these three figures, the ancient sage, the engaged intellectual, and the revolutionary military leader, began to take shape in the popular imagination. There were three distinct personalities, with different trajectories and styles, but who shared a common diagnosis of the ills afflicting Africa and a passionate commitment to finding authentic solutions rooted in the continent's own history and culture, not imposed from outside. Maponga, with his ability to connect with the masses through simple but deeply symbolic language, was the catalyst needed to transform diffuse discontent into a cohesive movement. His speeches were lessons in history, philosophy, and African spirituality, reviving ancestral values of unity, integrity, and service to the common good, and contrasting them with the greed, corruption, and subservience that, according to him, characterized many contemporary leaders. He did not limit himself to criticism. Maponga also presented an inspiring vision of an Africa reborn, an Africa that would free itself from the mental shackles of colonialism, that would value its own human and natural resources, and that would come together to face the challenges of the 21st century with strength and dignity. His message was one of hope, but an active hope, which required individual and collective responsibility, and the courage to break with old paradigms. Ndlozi, with his analytical acumen and ability to articulate the complex dynamics of global power, complemented Maponga's wisdom with a reasoned critique of the neocolonial structures that continued to oppress Africa. His speeches and writings exposed the pitfalls of foreign debt, the exploitation of natural resources by multinational corporations, and the complicity of certain African elites in the system of dispossession, providing an intellectual framework for the movement. Traoré, in turn, represented the dimension of concrete action, of leadership that was not afraid to make difficult decisions and confront established powers in the name of national sovereignty. His courage in defying France and seeking new alliances for Burkina Faso served as a practical example that it was possible to break away from dependence and chart an independent path. He became a living symbol of the new generation of African leaders who no longer bowed to the old metropolises. The convergence of these three voices, each with its own particular reach and resonance, created a powerful synergy. What had previously been isolated grievances or fragmented movements began to coalesce around a common narrative of liberation and African unity. The bombshell that Maponga was about to drop was therefore not an isolated event, but the culmination of a process of consciousness raising and mobilization that had been gaining momentum for some time. The world watched with a mixture of interest and apprehension. Some saw this movement as a promising sign of an African renaissance, an opportunity for the continent to finally realize its vast potential. Others, however, especially those whose interests were threatened by this new assertiveness, feared instability and the emergence of a radical nationalism that could lead to confrontation and rupture. Africa was once again at the center of global attention, but this time with its own protagonists dictating the terms of the debate. Maponga's bombshell would not be a literal explosion, but a torrent of uncomfortable truths, a manifesto articulated with the clarity of lightning and the force of thunder, designed to shake consciences and expose, without subterfuge, the anatomy of the betrayal perpetrated by false leaders against their own people. The setting for this crucial proclamation was carefully chosen, a large popular assembly, convened in a symbolic site of the struggle for independence, where the energy of the crowd and the solemnity of the moment would amplify the impact of his words. Days before the event, the expectation was already palpable. Caravans of people from all over the country, and even from neighboring nations, began to head to the site, many traveling for days on foot or in precarious transport, driven by the hope of witnessing a historic moment and hearing the voice that promised to articulate their deepest desires. The atmosphere was one of pilgrimage, of an appointment with destiny, where the future of the continent seemed to be at stake. Meanwhile, the false leaders, mentioned by Maponga, those who felt directly targeted by his rhetoric, watched with increasing nervousness. Some tried to downplay the event, dismissing Maponga as a demagogue or a dreamer out of touch with reality. Others, more cunning, tried to co-opt him, offering positions or favors in exchange for his silence or moderation in his criticism. But Maponga, true to his principles, refused all offers, further strengthening his image of integrity and incorruptibility. On the appointed day, countless crowds gathered under the bright sun, their faces expressing a mixture of hope, weariness, and determination. Flags of various African nations fluttered in the wind, symbolizing the yearning for unity that transcended the artificial borders imposed by colonialism. Songs of freedom and exaltation of African identity echoed across the vast esplanade, creating an electrifying, almost sacred atmosphere of popular communion. When Maponga finally took the improvised stage, dressed in traditional attire that evoked ancestral nobility, a profound silence fell over the crowd. All eyes were fixed on him, all ears attentive to the message he was about to deliver. He did not need powerful microphones. His voice, charged with natural authority and contagious passion, seemed to reach every heart present, as if he were speaking to each one individually. His speech began with a salute to the ancestors, acknowledging the wisdom and sacrifices of those who came before and who fought for the dignity of the African people. He then delved into the heart of the matter, exposing, with names and concrete examples, the corrupt practices, subservient policies and betrayals committed by those leaders who, according to him, had sold the soul of Africa in exchange for power and personal wealth, enriching themselves illicitly while their people suffered. Maponga did not limit himself to denouncing internal corruption. He also exposed, with relentless clarity, the neocolonial mechanisms through which foreign powers continued to exploit the continent's resources, often with the active or passive complicity of false leaders. He spoke of unfair contracts, the evasion of foreign exchange, the imposition of economic policies that benefited only the elites and multinational corporations, and the manipulation of ethnic conflicts to keep the continent divided and weakened. Maponga's bombshell was actually a series of interconnected revelations that painted a bleak picture of Africa's reality, but also pointed to the responsibility of every citizen to change it. He offered no easy solutions or empty promises. Instead, he called on people to wake up from their lethargy, demand accountability from their rulers, organize themselves into popular movements, and build from the ground up a new Africa based on justice, solidarity, and sovereignty. His message found a powerful echo in the ideas defended by Ndlozi and the actions of Captain IBRAHIM Traoré. Maponga, in a way, was providing the philosophical and moral basis for Ndlozi's intellectual critique and Traoré's revolutionary praxis. Together, they formed a formidable tripod, capable of inspiring and mobilizing different segments of African society, from urban intellectuals and activists to the rural masses and idealistic youth. At the end of his speech, which lasted for hours but seemed like a moment to the mesmerized crowd, Maponga made a passionate appeal for African unity. He argued that ethnic, regional and national divisions were traps created to weaken the continent and facilitate its exploitation. Only through unity, solidarity and the building of strong Pan-African institutions could Africa free itself from its shackles and take its rightful place in the concert of nations as a sovereign and prosperous continent. The repercussions of Maponga's explosive speech were immediate and overwhelming, spreading like wildfire across the African continent and beyond. The speaker's words, loaded with raw truth, resonated deeply in the hearts and minds of millions of people who felt betrayed by their leaders and yearned for radical change. Social media was flooded with excerpts from the speech, memes supporting Maponga and heated debates about the future of Africa, creating an unprecedented wave of awareness. The false leaders, those who had been directly or indirectly exposed by Maponga's allegations, reacted with a mixture of panic and fury. Some tried to discredit the speaker, accusing him of inciting violence, of being an irresponsible populist, or even an agent of foreign powers seeking to destabilize the continent. Others, more subtly, tried to co-opt the message, promising empty reforms and cosmetic investigations into corruption in a desperate attempt to appease popular anger. However, the seeds of doubt and indignation had already been planted, and the African people, increasingly informed and connected, were not easily fooled by empty promises. Maponga's denunciations, combined with Ndlozi's critical analysis and the example of assertive leadership by Captain IBRAHIM Traoré, created fertile ground for the emergence of popular movements demanding transparency, justice and governance truly committed to the collective well-being. In several African capitals, peaceful demonstrations began to take to the streets, with citizens of all ages and social classes holding up posters with the faces of Maponga, Ndlozi and Traoré, and chanting slogans calling for an end to corruption, the renegotiation of unfair contracts with foreign companies and the construction of a united and sovereign Africa. The fear that had previously paralyzed many began to give way to renewed civic courage, inspired by the boldness of their new heroes. Western powers, whose economic and geopolitical interests in Africa were often questioned by Maponga and his allies, watched the situation with growing concern. There were fears that the wave of nationalism and Pan-Africanism could lead to a review of trade agreements, the nationalization of natural resources, or even the expulsion of their companies from the continent. Diplomats and lobbyists worked hard behind the scenes to protect the interests of their countries and corporations. On the other hand, emerging powers such as China and Russia saw the crisis as an opportunity to expand their influence in Africa, offering alternative models of cooperation and investment, often without the political conditions imposed by the West. However, there was also a suspicion that these new partners could, in the long term, reproduce new forms of dependence and exploitation, requiring constant vigilance and astute negotiating skills from African leaders. The great challenge for the movement inspired by Maponga, Ndlozi and Traoré was to translate popular fervor into concrete and lasting change. Raising awareness and mobilizing were important steps, but they were not enough. It was necessary to build strong democratic institutions, strengthen the rule of law, promote education and innovation, and create an economic environment that created opportunities for all, especially for the youth, who represented the majority of the continent's population. The idea of a united Africa, while inspiring, also faced enormous practical obstacles. Historical divisions, regional rivalries, cultural and linguistic differences, and the particular interests of individual nations were complex challenges that could not be overcome overnight. Building continental unity would require patience, dialogue, mutual concessions and, above all, visionary leadership capable of transcending particularisms in the name of the greater good. Maponga, Ndlozi and Traoré, each in their own way, understood the magnitude of this task. They knew that the struggle for Africa's liberation would not be easy or quick, and that there would be setbacks and disappointments along the way. But they were determined to press on, inspired by their faith in their people and by the conviction that Africa deserved a better future, a future where its children could live in dignity, freedom and prosperity, in a continent that was truly master of its own destiny. The legacy of this trio of leaders was beginning to be written, not just with fiery words or insightful analyses, but with the courage to challenge the status quo, to awaken consciences and to mobilize an entire continent in search of its redemption. Maponga's bomb had not destroyed. On the contrary, it had built bridges of hope and lit a flame of transformation that promised to light the way for a new African dawn, more just and sovereign. The wave of awareness and mobilization triggered by Maponga's words and the convergence of voices with Ndlozi and Traoré began to produce the first tangible, albeit modest, results in different parts of the continent. In some countries, governments under popular pressure began to launch more serious investigations into corruption cases involving high-ranking officials, leading to the arrest of figures previously considered untouchable. The mere threat of public exposure and popular anger began to have a deterrent effect on false leaders. Elsewhere, civil society movements, strengthened by the new atmosphere of empowerment, were able to block the approval of laws or contracts that were clearly detrimental to national interests, such as the sale of fertile land to foreign investors at ridiculous prices or the granting of mining licenses without proper environmental and social safeguards. Citizen participation in the oversight of government actions increased significantly, demonstrating the maturation of participatory democracy. Pressure for greater transparency in the management of natural resources was also gaining momentum. Local communities, which had previously watched passively as foreign companies exploited their wealth without receiving significant benefits, began to organize to demand a fairer sharing of profits, respect for their territorial rights, and mitigation of environmental impacts. The idea that Africa's resources belong to Africans and should be used primarily for their development was gaining more and more supporters. On the international stage, Africa's new assertiveness was beginning to be felt. Delegations from African countries, in forums such as the United Nations and the World Trade Organization, were adopting firmer positions in defending the continent's interests, questioning unfair global trade rules, demanding the cancellation of odious debts and demanding that rich countries fulfill their promises to aid development and combat climate change, of which Africa was one of the greatest victims. The search for more diverse and balanced partnerships was also intensifying. African countries, inspired by the example of Burkina Faso under Traoré, began to explore new alliances with emerging powers and other countries of the global south, seeking to reduce their historical dependence on former colonial metropolises. South-South cooperation in areas such as technology, agriculture and infrastructure was gaining new momentum, opening up new prospects for the autonomous development of the continent. However, the road to profound and lasting transformation was still long and fraught with obstacles. The false leaders and neocolonial interests would not give in easily. They used every means at their disposal to discredit the movement, to sow division among its leaders, and to repress popular demonstrations. State violence, censorship of the press, and manipulation of electoral processes continued to be tactics employed to slow the momentum of change. Furthermore, the movement's leaders themselves faced internal challenges. Maintaining unity of purpose among figures as diverse as Maponga, Ndlozi and Traoré required constant dialogue, respect for differences and an ability to transcend egos and personal ambitions. There was also the risk that the movement, once in power, could reproduce some of the vices it was combating, such as authoritarianism or cooperation, if there were no solid mechanisms for social control and renewal of leadership. The issue of violence and instability in some parts of the continent also posed a formidable challenge. Armed conflicts, fueled by disputes over resources, ethnic tensions or the action of extremist groups, continued to claim lives, displace populations and undermine development efforts. Building lasting peace and effective security institutions was a precondition for Africa to realize its potential for progress. Despite all these difficulties, optimism and determination remained. The seed of hope planted by Maponga, Ndlozi and Traoré had found fertile soil in the hearts of millions of Africans, and the harvest, although still uncertain, promised to be abundant. Africa was on the move, and the world was watching closely this journey of self-discovery, struggle and building a future where the continent could finally be the protagonist of its own history. The legacy of this new generation of African leaders and thinkers would not be measured solely by their immediate political victories, but by their ability to inspire a profound cultural and mental transformation, a rediscovery of African pride and identity, and a renewed commitment to the values of justice, solidarity, and unity. It was a revolution of conscience, as important as any change of regime or economic policy, and its effects would be felt for generations to come. The journey towards a united and truly sovereign Africa, driven by Maponga's vision, Ndlozi's critical analysis and Traoré's determined action, was entering a crucial phase of consolidation and of confronting increasingly organized resistance. The false leaders, feeling the ground shaking beneath their feet, intensified their maneuvers to discredit the movement, using the state machinery, controlled media and, in some cases, brute force to try to silence the voices of change and intimidate the population. Smear campaigns were launched against Maponga, Ndlozi and Traoré, seeking to tarnish their reputations with false accusations of corruption, extremism or collusion with hostile foreign powers. The strategy was clear: divide and conquer, sowing distrust among the movement's leaders and their followers, and trying to isolate them from popular support. Fake news and rumors were spread on social media, exploiting fears and prejudices to undermine the credibility of the new leadership. In addition, neo-colonial interests, feeling their privileges threatened, were also mobilizing behind the scenes. International lobbyists worked to influence Western governments not to support the African renewal movement, portraying it as a threat to regional stability and foreign investment. Economic pressures, such as the suspension of financial aid or the imposition of veiled sanctions, were used as tools to weaken governments that dared to challenge the status quo. However, the resilience of the movement was surprising. Maponga, with his ancestral wisdom, responded to the attacks with calmness and an appeal for truth and nonviolence, reminding his followers that their greatest strength lay in the justice of their cause and the unity of their hearts. Ndlozi, with his eloquence, unmasked the tactics of defamation and manipulation, exposing the contradictions and hidden interests behind the disinformation campaigns, and urging people to maintain critical thinking. Traoré, for his part, demonstrated in practice that it was possible to resist external pressures and build a sovereign path. His government in Burkina Faso, despite immense challenges, moved forward with internal reforms, seeking to strengthen the local economy, improve public services and guarantee the security of the population, while at the same time diversifying its international partnerships, without submitting to the diktats of any foreign power. His example inspired other leaders to follow the same path. Solidarity between the three leaders and their movements also grew stronger in the face of adversity. Regular, albeit discreet, meetings were held to exchange information, coordinate strategies, and reaffirm commitment to the common cause. There was a recognition that the struggle was long and arduous, and that unity was the most powerful weapon against the enemies of African transformation. The complementarity of their talents and approaches proved to be a force multiplier. African youth, increasingly aware of their role as protagonists of change, continued to be at the forefront of the movement. Through social networks, study groups, community projects, and peaceful demonstrations, young people expressed their creativity, energy, and idealism, pushing for reforms, proposing innovative solutions to the continent's problems, and building bridges of dialogue and solidarity between different countries and cultures. The challenge of translating the vision of a united Africa into concrete reality remained immense. Pan-African institutions, such as the African Union, still needed to be reformed and strengthened so that they could play a more effective role in promoting peace, democracy, and sustainable development on the continent. It was necessary to overcome the logic of narrow national interests and build a true community of destiny, based on shared values and common goals. Despite all the difficulties and resistance, the flame of hope lit by Maponga, Ndlozi and Traoré continued to burn brightly. The seed of a new Africa, more just, more sovereign, and more united, had been planted, and its fruits, although still uncertain, promised to fuel the aspirations of millions of people for a future where the continent could finally occupy the prominent place that its history, culture, and potential deserved on the global stage. The legacy of this struggle would not be merely political or economic, but profoundly existential. It was about restoring the dignity of a people, healing the wounds of the colonial past, and building a new African identity, proud of its roots and confident in its future. It was a journey of self-discovery and collective empowerment, the impact of which would transcend the borders of the continent and inspire other oppressed peoples in their quest for freedom and justice. The narrative of a changing Africa, driven by the unified voices of Maponga, Ndlozi and Traoré, was beginning to transcend the continent's borders, capturing the imagination and support of progressive movements and thoughtful citizens around the world. The African diaspora, spread across 5 continents, played a particularly crucial role in this dissemination, acting as a cultural and political bridge between Africa and the rest of the world, amplifying the messages of its leaders and mobilizing international solidarity. Intellectuals, artists and activists from diverse backgrounds expressed their support for the cause of African unity and sovereignty, recognizing in their struggle a reflection of universal aspirations for justice, dignity, and self-determination. Conferences were organized, articles were published, and documentaries were produced to give visibility to the movement and to deconstruct the negative stereotypes that had for so long obscured the true face of Africa. This growing international solidarity, however, also provoked counter-reactions from those who saw the African awakening as a threat to their hegemonic interests. Disinformation campaigns were intensified on a global scale, seeking to portray the movement as extremist, anti-Western, or as a puppet of rival powers. The battle of narratives became increasingly fierce, with each side trying to win hearts and minds in the arena of global public opinion. Despite attempts to discredit the movement, the message of Maponga, Ndlozi and Traoré continued to gain ground, as it touched on universal truths about the need to combat exploitation, corruption, and injustice wherever they manifested themselves. The struggle for African liberation was seen not only as a regional issue, but as part of a broader global effort to build a more balanced, multipolar, and humane world. Within Africa itself, the challenge of maintaining the unity and momentum of the movement in the face of internal and external pressures required increasingly wise and strategic leadership. Maponga, with his spiritual vision and his ability to connect with the deepest aspirations of the people, continued to be the moral compass of the movement, reminding everyone of the ethical principles that should guide the struggle and the construction of the new Africa. Ndlozi, with his intellectual acumen, dedicated himself to formulating concrete proposals for the reform of the continent's political and economic institutions, seeking to create development models that were at the same time effective, inclusive, and sustainable. He emphasized the importance of education, science, and technology as essential tools for African emancipation and for overcoming dependence on the global north. Traoré, for his part, focused on demonstrating, through the example of Burkina Faso, that it was possible to build a sovereign, secure, and prosperous state, even in an environment of great challenges. His policies of strengthening local agriculture, promoting national industry, and investing in basic infrastructure served as an inspiring model for other countries seeking to break away from the logic of exporting raw materials and importing manufactured goods. The union of these 3 approaches, spiritual, intellectual, and pragmatic, created a powerful synergy, capable of mobilizing different segments of African society and offering comprehensive responses to the continent's complex problems. The movement was neither monolithic nor dogmatic. It was a dynamic process of learning, debate, and collective construction, open to the contributions of all those who shared the dream of a better Africa. The future, although still uncertain, seemed more promising than ever. The seed of hope, planted by the words and actions of Maponga, Ndlozi and Traoré, was blossoming in a garden of popular initiatives, transformative projects, and a new civic consciousness. Africa, for so long silenced and subjugated, was rising with the strength of a sleeping giant, ready to reclaim its destiny and to surprise the world with its creativity, its resilience, and its ability to build a future of peace and prosperity for all its children. Africa's journey towards unity and sovereignty is a story of courage, resilience, and an unwavering faith in the power of transformation. The voices of Maponga, Ndlozi, and Traoré echo as a call for all of us, wherever we are, to join in building a more just and fraternal world. May your struggles and visions inspire us. We invite you to subscribe to our channel and activate the bell so you don't miss any of our future stories. Your like is essential for us to continue producing content that informs and moves. And please leave your comment below, sharing your thoughts on this powerful movement. Thank you for listening and see you next time.